Alright, we have two movies this week because, so predictably, we didn't get Queen and Slim around here. But still a very satisfying weekend, nonetheless. Let's start with The Irishman, which is yet more proof that Scorsese's pretty much one of the best people to ever do this. When you look at the fact that this was, like, so many years in the making, like decades, and it's following so closely to Silence, which was a few years ago, which was another movie, much like The Irishman, that Scorsese's been putting together for decades, to the point that we were never quite sure we were ever going to see it. And I remember the more news that came out about The Irishman in its current state as it was being made, there was so much disbelief, like, oh, I'll believe it when a trailer comes out, or I'll believe it when I see a still, or something. And yeah, so it's yet another case of, I can't believe this exists, but it does. In all of its 3.5 hour glory, which when it's Scorsese, that doesn't really matter. If anything with Scorsese, the longer the better, as we've seen. But we'll talk more about the length as we go on. But to start off with, it was kind of built up when the first screening started happening that it was built up as being yet another masterpiece from him. But another thing I kept hearing a lot was that it wasn't necessarily completely the Scorsese we always expect, where it's like really sort of high energy and stuff like that. But it was much more of a sort of downplayed style, and that's pretty much true. But it does you just immediately feel the whole Scorsese thing when it starts with In the Still of the Night playing, and we get the tracking shot so early. It's the first shot, and one of many throughout the movie. But to start off that way just feels promising in general as we go through, and we have De Niro narrating. And obviously one of the stronger aspects of Scorsese's movies is how he handles narration. And you can tell immediately that there's kind of an immediate Goodfellas feel with the first line when he says, when I was young I thought house painters painted houses. But when it starts off as narration, and then when the camera comes around to him in like his old state, the narration transitions into him just speaking out loud. And it was then that it was like, okay, so we're definitely getting Scorsese, but it feels like it's not going to necessarily be like just him doing the same old thing all the time, which even if he did, it would still be amazing. But there's something so exciting to immediately start the movie off with, okay, so we're getting him, but we might be getting something a little different also. And that's, yeah, so to just start off that way made the next 3.5 hours really easy, as if it wasn't going to be. And you look at the cast, which was sort of like the main selling point for a while there, where it was De Niro, Pacino working with Scorsese for the first time. They brought Pesci out of retirement, and then everybody from Bobby Cannavale to Harvey Keitel is going to be in here, and so many other people. And it's... Yeah, Bobby Cannavale is especially a case where it was like, after seeing him in the third season of Boardwalk Empire, it's like it was only... Like, it's him being in a Scorsese gangster movie is just kind of a long time coming. And it's much like most of the people that aren't the main three being De Niro, Pacino, and Pesci. It's, I guess you could say, more or less glorified cameos. They're a little more than that, but it wouldn't necessarily be arguable if somebody were to put it that way. And you would think, I was a little concerned for a while there of just the star power of it all being maybe a bit distracting, but not really. They fall into it so easily. Like when you see Pesci, who has a significantly bigger part than I had assumed that he had, with what he must have agreed to finally be in, because I'd heard he like turned the movie down like 50 times or something, like with no exaggeration. But it's like it's a really big role throughout the movie, and it was almost like every time we see him, is it going to be distracting? That we're all just so thrilled that he came out of retirement. And I guess he recently said something to Scorsese where he may have been joking or may have been not, that he didn't consider himself retired. He was just looking for something this good, I guess. But yeah, the way everything falls in. I think it's also the way they're sort of spread out there for a while, where it's really the De Niro Pesci thing for a lot of the movie, and then it's almost if it's like probably almost an hour in when Pacino even shows up. But the way it all falls into place, everybody here is just in the perfect place, and it's really just about everything you would hope it would be. And then there is the whole de-aging thing, I guess, that a lot of people were concerned about, and it was apparently what really blew up the budget of the movie and what took it so long. Like, it was, I think there was a point in time where it was gonna come out last year, potentially, and then it was, well, we've got to make sure the visual effects are as close to perfect as they can be before we do this, and that basically took an entire other year. The whole de-aging thing is never real. Like, when Rogue One came out with, like, the Peter Cushing thing and Carrie Fisher, people were, like, really critical and saying, oh, it looks so weird and it looks really off. I've never really had much of an issue with any of the de-aging stuff that we've seen so far, at least that I can remember. And this is really no different. And I think, and I guess at the very start, if anything, the standout thing that's kind of hard to not notice is how blue De Niro's eyes are. It can maybe kind of distract you a little bit, but apart from that, especially as it goes on, like maybe when you first see them, it might throw you off, but it's really easy to get used to if it's something that you're not immediately just absorbed in from the start. You should be able to get there, and Scorsese has kind of had like a really good knack for subtle visual effects, and I don't know how many people know that. Like there is a video online that shows the visual effects shots and the green screen shots that are in The Wolf of Wall Street, of all things, and there is a ton of them, and nobody noticed because they were so subtle yet so well done also. So when you think of a visual effects heavy Scorsese movie, it's like he can still do that without going much farther off than a typical movie like these. Obviously stuff like Hugo you can tell, but yeah, the more subtle stuff, I imagine how much of that is here. There's every now and then there's a scene that is not perfect. There's a scene very early where De Niro has to beat up a grocer that shoved his daughter, and it's like he shoves the guy through a door, and the glass breaking is clear CGI, and it's like the way De Niro's moving, you can tell how old he actually is. And that's something I hadn't really taken into account, but Scorsese was telling a story about one of the scenes he shot with Pacino, and it's like, yeah, that's the whole thing. It's not necessarily just de-aging. They have to move like they're not as old as they are, which I guess was an issue. And you can see that throughout, but it's not really. It's hardly much of a distraction at all, especially when their performances themselves pull you in so much anyway, and the interactions between them. So that's. Yeah, so that doesn't really bother me. I guess every now and then, it's not even stuff like that that may pull you out of it. Like there's a scene at one point where De Niro's character has to meet up with David Ferry, which threw me off for a second because it's like, oh, that's weird because Pesci played him in JFK, and it's like that was more of what made me acknowledge like, oh, it's crazy that Pesci's in this. Not necessarily because he came out of retirement or the CGI or whatever. No, just stuff like that. So none of that really bothered me. Unless those, like, couple of moments in this 3.5-hour movie that were pretty noticeable, but who the fuck cares? So, talking about the performances themselves, with De Niro at the head of this, yeah, this is a very downplayed De Niro, but that's kind of, we talked about this however long ago that was, 4 years ago when I did my Goodfellas Casino video, and I had talked about how De Niro's impact in Goodfellas is so subtle compared to the liveliness around him, particularly with Tommy, and that's pretty much what it is here, and because this isn't necessarily a movie that has, like, over-the-top performances. Pacino does get, a couple of trademark yelling scenes, but apart from that, it's all pretty downplayed performance-wise, which is especially interesting to see out of Pesci when you associate Pesci with Scorsese gangster movie, you think, of, you know, Tommy and Nicky, and him just going as big as possible, and he's still, it's kind of incredible how easy it is to take him as just the downplayed character that he is. And it's really, really strong stuff, especially for somebody that hasn't acted for a while, but you can just tell how it's inherently in him the second you watch it. So it's, and then there's a lot of silent moments with De Niro that really makes this point also. Like those are his strongest moments, actually, or when he's just not saying anything at all, and he's usually alone in the scene. There's towards the end there is a phone call that he makes, and it's that's one of the stronger scenes in the movie. And there's also a lot of like, it could be, I couldn't quite tell. It's like there's a lot of moments in the movie where people seem to be tripping over their dialogue. But whether that was intentional or not, I don't think matters, because it brought in this sort of, because you normally when you go into these movies, like, you know, especially like The Wolf of Wall Street, how there's such a deliberate nature to the dialogue and how it's the way it comes out and how it's almost poetic. It really adds an authenticity to it to hear people say in a movie like this, saying like real things that sound real when they say them. So that, I thought that was a really interesting detail. Like I said, whether it was intentional or not, I really couldn't tell. But I mean, if it was, all the more power to them that I can't tell the difference. But there's also, like, especially towards the later parts of the movie, there are moments where De Niro just, especially in a very crucial scene, where De Niro's whole performance is just breathing heavily. And it's like he's breathe acting. And it's like, for people that think De Niro's past his prime, the dude is breathe acting in this movie, and it's amazing. And it's really impactful. So yeah, and there's even moments like towards the end where you can tell the dialogue thing is a bit more intentional, because when he's narrating, he's obviously much older, and it's like when it gets towards the end of the movie, and you can tell he's getting towards the end of the story, there are moments where his narration just kind of trails off, like he forgets what he's even saying, and he just kind of stops, and it's stuff like that is really good. So, and obviously, one of the most exciting things about going into a Scorsese movie is the editing, because Thelma Schoonmaker is one of the absolute masters, honestly, if not the master of the whole art of it. There's a particular moment, there's a couple of moments that are just so brilliant. You can do the whole, oh, it's on Netflix thing, this is a movie that should be seen in a theater and stuff like that. And while that's absolutely true, I did very much appreciate it, because there are a couple of moments in the editing in this movie that are so genius, I had to go back and watch them again. And it's, because there's one, the introduction to Bobby Cannavale is so interesting, because it's a shot of him, and we don't know necessarily in the moment, I guess if you don't know which character he's playing, or his place in this, where exactly it stands in the timeline, because he's going to meet, De Niro's going to meet Bobby Cannavale, who's like much older in the scene that he's meeting him in, but right before that we get a scene of him much younger, just cutting a chicken's head off, and that's it, that's the only scene. And they just say, you know, in passing in dialogue, like 30 seconds later, yeah, they call him, you know, Skinny Razor because he used to work in a butcher shop. And it's like, oh yeah, we know that because we saw him cut the chicken's head off 30 seconds ago when he was younger. And it's like, and that was the introductory shot of him before we actually saw him in the present day of the moment. And it's like, just that choice is just so, it's just something that nobody else would think of. And that's great. And there's also a moment that I had the same reaction to, where Pacino's wife is contemplating whether or not she's about to start a car that may or may not have a car bomb in it. And there's a particular edit in there that is just so fucking good. And you get those throughout also. But another thing about the editing, though, is you'll notice, like I was saying, as far as the length goes and the downplayed nature of it, it's not the usual Scorsese pace. Where, like, if you sit down to watch Casino or The Wolf of Wall Street and you're like, oh, a 3-hour movie. Wow, this'll be an investment. And then it's like you're struck by a bolt of lightning, and suddenly 3 hours has passed. And that's how those movies work. But with this one is obviously much more sort of the way it drags itself out. But I don't mean that in a negative sense by any means. Everything just feels like you feel so lived in when you watch certain scenes. Even scenes that seem not that important. And there's also a lot of scenes that you might think aren't important that eventually are. And it's... Yeah, so all of that was just really working for me. And it's... So it may not have... Yeah, I suppose it may not have the rewatchability factor of something like The Wolf of Wall Street Casino talking about his 3-hour movies. But there's still... Yeah, there is a point I want to make towards the end, though, so we'll come back to that. But there's also the visual flair. Like I said, whether you're seeing it in a theater or on Netflix or whatever. Like, starting with the interesting choice to have when a lot of the characters are introduced, because it's history and because they're real people. If you know enough about it, you know these people's fates in one way or another. Or obviously we're in a different time period, so most of these people are probably dead anyway, if not all of them. So they do this thing where when a major character is introduced, or even a minor character is introduced, their name flashes on the screen, but not just their name, but their cause of death. Which just kind of shows, it really brings you into the world of it in general, but also shows you that, like, it's not like a spoiler kind of movie, because the fates of these characters don't really matter. It's everything that comes before that. That's the real meat of pretty much everything these people did in this story. So that's great stuff. And then there's also just every now and then, just like a visual shot or whatever, like the thing. He's also describing it in narration, but the moment when De Niro, does a hit and then throws his gun in the river, and we watch the gun go all the way to the bottom of the river where there's just a whole sea of guns on the floor of this, and that's so stuff like that. And then there's even a shot that stands out where there is a scene involving like a whole lot of yellow cabs, but the way it's like framed where they're off to the side, it's like this sort of drab background or setting, and then just this area of yellow over here, just stuff like that just really stands out on the screen, so that's great. And then we talked about sort of the glorified cameo thing and people kind of coming in and out. Another major player in this that's definitely not a glorified cameo would be Stephen Graham, who's really great with material like this. He was Babyface Nelson in Public Enemies, and he was Al Capone on Boardwalk Empire. Most people probably know him as Tommy from Snatch, but he's really kind of grown to be a big figure in this genre that keeps coming up and getting these really substantial roles and just like killing them, and it's really good. And the tensions between him and Pacino are like some of the best stuff in the movie. Like when the movie like kind of really takes off in its middle portion, or the scenes with him and Pacino and the relationship between those two characters. So, and the way that sort of thing can kind of bounce around throughout the whole movie, and how the movie has room to do that, where it's like you have the real strengths of the De Niro-Pesci relationship being the whole meat of like the first part of the movie, and then we bring Pacino into it, and then it's the De Niro-Pacino thing. Then we've got the Pacino-Stephen Graham thing. And then there's even the moments when, like, late in the movie when Pacino's interacting with Pesci, and it's like, it feels like a whole complete thing. And to see all of these different actors getting all these different moments with each other, like, individually, is just so... It's so exciting, like I said, even in the most mundane scenes, because that's how it works when you make a movie like this with actors like this. And the way Scorsese just knows how to do those scenes like that, where they could have been talking about fucking anything. Like, this is... Obviously, we're talking about Scorsese, the guy that made, like, making sauce in Goodfellas, one of the most enticing things ever. And he has not lost that at all, especially in a movie like this. So, and there's also... If there's one person I would have liked to have seen have more to do, it would be Jesse Plemons, who fit into this type of world so well in Black Mass. But he does have it's a I guess you could say relatively crucial part. But he's really not here that much. But it's like the fact that he's not here that much is kind of the point of his character, so it's kind of hard to complain. But I would have liked to have seen him with kind of what he would have done with maybe one of the more juicy parts, because I feel like he could really handle a big part in something like this. And yeah, and every now and then there's just individual scenes that stand out. There's a scene with a watermelon that kind of felt like an instant classic. And another strong aspect throughout the movie is a character that doesn't have a shitload of screen time, but has amazing staying power, and that's Peggy, De Niro's daughter, who is eventually later in life played by Anna Paquin, but Anna Paquin's like barely in the movie. I remember her maybe having like 2 lines. But the character is so crucial, and it's the whole storyline is such a strong aspect of the movie itself. Particularly with the way she reacts to things, where like she grows to really love Hoffa like immediately, yet she's really put off by Russell, Pesci's character, like from her childhood and then all the way pretty much through life. So seeing the stuff like that and the way she reacts to this stuff, even though she's really just a side character, is... Yeah, so how they're able to handle all this stuff, like even the small things can be shown so much light and really add such a crucial factor to the movie itself. It all just works so well. And then you get scenes like when the Kennedy assassination eventually happens, and the way everybody reacts in this diner and gathers around the TV, and then seeing Hoffa's reactions after the fact and how much they contrast with what we just saw. There's a really strong scene involving Hoffa and a flag at half-mast that's like, wow. So, yeah. And as far as the length goes, and about it maybe not having the rewatchability factor or, you know, the pace that he's had in other movies, what I was really loving about it was how, if you're really drawn into it, how kind of, I don't know how else to word it, but like how comfortable the movie makes you with it, where like by the time we reached about the 2-hour mark or the 2.5-hour mark, it occurred to me to like, it's almost interesting how it seems odd for a Scorsese movie to go to Netflix like and premiere there, despite the fact that it's had a theatrical run since the beginning of the month. But it's like it almost kind of also perfectly fits Netflix, because it feels like it's gonna be one of those movies, like a background movie, where it's like the movie's just kind of part of like your own home. Like, and when I say that, when I say like background movie, you think background noise, which kind of maybe sounds negative, but I'm thinking more like when you have the Godfather movies on, just in the background, like at gatherings and everything, like how Thanksgiving is tomorrow and IFC is playing like the Godfather movies all day. And it's like this would fit that perfectly. So yeah, and like the more the movie goes on, the more enticing it is. The whole, I don't know if I should say exactly what it is, but the big crucial moment that's like a 20-minute or so chunk of time, like towards when we're getting towards the end, is some of my favorite stuff of this year. Like that's something where, another thing where I'm grateful for Netflix, because I feel like I'm gonna go back and just watch that whole thing like over and over and over again by itself. And it's so, just as an individual thing, it's so good, but the movie as a whole is really what works here, and why that length is warranted. So yeah, so like it's weird to find so many upsides of it being on Netflix, but they're there. But I do wish I had gotten the theater experience with this also, but that's how releases work, and especially being in an area like this, you just kind of have to deal with it. But maybe the time will eventually come. So yeah, so and the more I think about it too, because I watched it I got up at like 5 o'clock this morning to make sure I was going to be able to watch it and do everything else I need to do before I went to see Knives Out, and it's been sticking with me. And I imagine that's not gonna, like, I imagine the whole weekend, and then maybe all of next week, this movie will still be just living in my mind. So yes, so amazing, obviously. And it's like, you look back and it's like, how was it not going to be? People had like their doubts, because it's like, oh, they're going to do the de-aging thing, is that going to work? And it's like, oh god, it's taken so long to make, there's so many delays, and it's like, oh god, what if it's a disaster? And then you feel dumb, because it's like, how was this ever going to be a disaster? How was this not going to be the movie that it is? It's like, that's just even ludicrous to think this could have failed. So, yes. Nice. So let's go into Knives Out. Probably really quick, because I really have no choice but to be relatively vague, because this is the kind of movie where you just really shouldn't say much. Like, and it's kind of like all the way through also, where you think, like, you know, the whodunit genre and all that, and the whole Agatha Christie inspiration, and you think it's like, oh, it's a movie where it's a mystery, and then there's like one payoff, but there's, especially if you're familiar with Rian Johnson and the way that he, you know, constructs everything, the way he went after Noir and Brick, or the way he, you know, just went all out world building with Looper. He's a really he's an incredible director, but he is especially an incredible writer, and this movie is a huge testament to that. And it's really the kind of perfect movie. Like, if this, like, if you're a fan of his and you hear, like, you know, the Agatha Christie inspired Rian Johnson movie, this is probably exactly what you would think it would be, and I mean that in the best way. All the way down to the inclusion of Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who has had at least either a starring role or a small, like, cameo in all of Rian Johnson's movies. And I'm pretty sure at the very beginning, somebody's listening to, like, a TV show, and it's his voice, like, clear as day. Like, I'm almost certain. And Noah Segan, I believe, is also in every one of his movies, and he's here as one of the cops with Daniel Craig and Lakeith Stanfield. So it's a Rian Johnson movie through and through. And one of the things that immediately stands out is how it feels so old-fashioned. Like, everything about it screams that it would be set in a different time period, yet it is very much in present day. There are so many references to technology and Twitter and even Instagram at one point, and usually, much more often than not, I think that's something that's really, really forced. But it's just so, it's, like I said, it's such a contrast to how otherwise old-fashioned the movie feels, that it adds something to it. It adds a certain flair to it that's really great. And there's even the, there's the moment when Toni Collette says, like, she is introduced to Daniel Craig, and she's like, oh yeah, I read a tweet that was about an article that was about you. And then there's even a moment where, like, the unreliability of older technology, like VHS and VCRs, aren't reliable, and that actually comes into play. So it's a really clever use of that. But there's also talking about, you'll notice how much I'm going around the story, because you really can't say too much about it at all if you're going in totally blind. I don't think the advertisements give much or anything away from what I've heard. But, like, as far as costumes and production design also really bring this to life, where, like, it's the case of where, I think that plays another big part in how old-fashioned it feels, but also current at the same time. And it's one of those cases where you see whatever each character is wearing is almost like it says something about them. And it's like you can pinpoint their personalities just based on that alone, and just their general appearance. And then the production design is totally insane, because this house, in this sort of stroke of genius, to have this stuff around this house, where it's particularly, obviously there's going to be knives everywhere, there's a whole ongoing theme there. There's a really great scene that's kind of building to suspense before we even really realize it, where there's a knife sticking out of a table that's in the foreground, like right in our faces through the whole scene, but without being intrusive, just being totally and completely foreboding. And then obviously the giant knife-like display thing. And they're like, because Christopher Plummer's character is an author of, like, these mystery novels, he has, like, props made from his own stories that just cover this house and just give it this whole other personality. And there's, like, so many damn details in there. Stuff, probably a lot of which doesn't even get focused, like, probably barely even gets camera time. but the fact that it's there just adds so much flavor and character to like every surrounding in the movie, at least every surrounding inside the house, which is where a good portion of the movie is set. But another thing about it is the story structure. Once again, without saying too much, where it's like when you think about the cast, the incredible cast that was assembled for this, and it's like when I went into it, I was imagining it was going to be we actually see like there's a whole long opening before the death takes place where we see like the party in full and we see all the different characters and get their potential motives and all that. But obviously Johnson is much more going about the he wants to do this genre but definitely in a totally new way, and he seems to have started with the structure of it, where we do get many scenes of them, the family, interacting and going at each other's throats and all that. But it's the way it's split up because everything in the movie is in retrospect from a week after the plumber character's death and everybody trying to figure out what exactly happened. And so most of it that we see of the family really being like in their element without the inclusion of the cops is just all flashback, but all the entire piece that it ends up making will still satisfy anybody that went in hoping to have like the characters going back and forth and bouncing off of each other and stuff like that, even though we don't actually necessarily see the party in its fullest like as a whole sort of set piece in itself. It all comes together in a way. Like he's definitely got this all mapped out ahead of time, and it's incredibly satisfying to watch it all sort of come together. And like I said, when you've got a cast list like this with the characters that they're playing, they're perfectly lined up with their characters also, and it's and it's and to the point that I'm not even sure there's a standout, which is amazing because that's just about how strong all the characters are. Like they all kind of get their shining moment. I would say, I guess one of the meatier parts would be Chris Evans, and I think that's mainly because he's basically playing the epitome of slime, having just come off of playing Captain America, and it's like I think he even said there were like it was like mere days in between when he finished Endgame and when he started this. So it's like the contrast of that with that other character is also brings a lot to the character. Especially seeing him and Michael Shannon interact again after I was obviously such a huge fan of the Iceman. So all that, and even Lakeith Stanfield on the side of Daniel Craig most of the time has some really great moments. Also, there's a really great moment where this movie has so many different ways of showing off. It's very sometimes it's a very wry sense of humor. Sometimes it will go all out. There's even like a clever running joke that in any other movie would be a running joke that I would hate, but it's used in such a clever way through the whole movie that I can't fault it at all. But there's even just little things like the moment when Lakeith Stanfield's talking about Toni Collette hearing a ka-thunk sound above her head, and it immediately cuts to that of Toni Collette hearing that sound, and it pretty much sounds exactly like the way Lakeith Stanfield just described it. And it's like just even stuff like that is funny, the way it's executed. But also talking about the structure, I do want to go back to for a second. Once again, without really saying anything, there is like a lot that we know, like going in. Like it seems like they're showing their hand really early in a lot of cases, but there's so much up the movie's sleeve that it's, like I said, that's just the really brilliant writing that this has. And the last character I did want to talk about, going back now, is Daniel Craig, who's kind of, I guess you could say, at the center of it because he's the main, detective investigating. He's like the Poirot of the story, of course. But he feels much more like a Poirot, but at the same time, there's a later moment when he compares himself to Holmes, where he recruits somebody for assistance and he refers to them as Watson. But he's also like totally his own character also. And obviously, I've criticized Daniel Craig a lot for not having much charisma and being, in my opinion, kind of a boring actor a lot of the time. But when he gets the chance to really go for it, like the go to examples are usually like 10-10 or Road to Perdition or something. But after this and Logan Lucky, I'm starting to think that, interestingly enough, in my opinion anyway, I know people love him, in the Bond movies and all that, and as an action hero in general, but I personally am starting to think very quickly that comedy is his strong suit, which is something I never would have guessed. He hosted Saturday Night Live, I think, once, and he had some pretty strong moments on there also. So yeah, I'm actually convinced that Daniel Craig was probably born for comedy, and he just keeps getting put in the wrong roles because he's really perfect with this. Even his introductory scene, when people are being interrogated, and for a lot of this scene, he's just in the background, out of focus, before he's been introduced. And just to kind of, I don't know if he's fucking with them or what, but he's by a piano, and while people are being interrogated, he'll just interrupt their interrogation by just hitting one of the piano keys. And it's like, even before he's introduced, when we see him out of focus, it's like, I get the feeling we're gonna love this character. And yeah, he's probably, like, if I had to pick a particular standout, I would say it would either be Chris Evans or Daniel Craig. There's a lot of cases where they have a lot of, like Jamie Lee Curtis, for instance. She has, like, these really big moments, and she just really owns this character and really owns the screen every time she's there. But I would have probably liked to have seen more of her. But there's, like, so many characters we have to deal with and get all those moments in. It's Yeah, and then Ana de Armas obviously is, like, the main sort of center of this also. There's a lot of centers to this, interestingly enough, because, like I said, that's just really how well put together it is and how much the characters really get the chance to shine. And she's obviously very good also. Like, I wasn't sure about her because she hasn't gotten a lot to really, show off acting wise. But here she's really, yeah, it makes me interested to see what other kind of roles she could really inhabit well throughout her career. So yeah, and then of course, all the strong writing I've been talking about. Obviously, the dialogue falls into this also. There's a lot of those clever cases of, like, repeated lines throughout it, where, like, one character says one line, and then another character will say that line later in a different context. And it just all feels really, well constructed. Obviously, a lot of Craig's dialogue feels right out of, an Agatha Christie story, even despite feeling like his own character still. And there's even, and I know when people hear this, they might get, put off at first, but obviously being a bickering family set in the current era, the very current era, there's one or two moments throughout of them bickering about they're having political discussions. They get really heated. It's actually just kind of one scene where Toni Collette has one stance and Don Johnson has another. But then every now and then they also make, like, jabs at each other and stuff like that. But it all feels so authentic. And it's like, if that's the kind of thing that bothers you, it's only, like, here and there. And like I said, really just kind of sets up the authenticity. And it's like you've got characters in the family on both sides, and one's, like, really over the top in one way, and one's really over the top in the other, and it's, yeah, and that's great. And then just every now and then, just an individual line. Like, at some point, Chris Evans says, "This is stupid with two O's." Just lines like that I really appreciate. So yeah. Exactly what you'd expect. Production design and costumes are amazing. The characters and performances are amazing, and the dialogue and the structure and the turns and all that. The last 15 minutes or so, where we get the big moment where the detective lays everything out, is usually not a moment I care for too much in these types of stories, like the Agatha Christie type stories or the Holmes type stories, because a lot of it almost feels like far-fetched and lazy, and like they're filling in holes that we never could have as an audience and stuff like that. But Johnson really nailed that. Like, the best stuff in the movie is in the last 15 minutes, and that's saying something. So yeah, so like I said, that's about the best I can do. Being vague to not reveal anything about the story. So yes, so that's yeah. So next week, I believe, is when Marriage Story goes up on Netflix, and Dark Waters will be coming out. So it'll probably be that, and really anything else. Maybe Queen and Slim will come around. I don't know. And yeah, and some verses that I'll probably look into after all this Thanksgiving stuff passes. And I guess we're moving up a day. Apparently, it's going to be Friday that we're doing the awards video with me, Owen, and Ashley. So yeah, and then we'll be talking more about the Irishman probably. So most definitely. So yeah, that's all the stuff that's coming. So until all that stuff, I think that's it.